I think the first thing that, when we started working on this section, what struck us was how complex the issue of exclusion in the education sector is, and how much of overlapping and intersecting axes of exclusion there are. I mean, it's it's almost impossible to sort of separate out the different elements and the different manifestations, the overall structural issues from the microprocessors, etc. But we have tried to do that, and in the process, what we have really tried to do is to kind of try and also join the dots between, how exclusion has been articulated, conceptualized in the wider framework of, say, the Constitution, the kind of other philosophical ideas on education which have been part of the thinking on education in this sector, and to join that understanding with what is really going on the ground, so the empirical reality in the microprocesses at different levels. We've also in this section tried to, by looking separately at systemic issues and at the community-based issues, we've also tried to join those dots and see how those are also sort of connected in a kind of a continuum of exclusion that has the manifestations for education. Like in other areas, extremely limited data has been a huge constraint for us. I mean, large-scale databases on the group separately hardly exist, so we've had to rely largely on case studies and individual research and anecdotal evidence. But that has also provided a kind of a very rich source of information in a sense, and really brought a lot of different voices into the report. So across the spectrum, from looking at philosophical understanding, what the Constitution has to say, what are the different elements in policy, within the schools and classrooms, and even across the experiences of marginalized groups in the communities. We tried in all phases to highlight the voices of the marginalized themselves. And then on the other hand, we have then looked in quite a bit of detail at what is really the reality in terms of the experiences and the manifestations, the mechanisms of exclusion in the education sector. And here we have sort of made a difference between how exclusion takes place in the system. We've also looked separately at how exclusion plays a role in the community, and what is the and from that how it overlaps in the education sector, in schools and classrooms. And we've also looked at the interface of community with the system, and how there too exclusionary practices play a role in marginalizing children from some of these backgrounds. As far as the systemic exclusion is concerned, that we have sort of divided it into three sets of issues. And we looked first at those children who have been marginalized or excluded from the system in a sense completely, or have the least access to education. Then we have looked at how the policy and the whole mechanism of the state thinking also implicit in that is a kind of exclusion. So the way policies have been formulated, the way programs have been designed, there is an undercurrent or an implicit kind of exclusion that is taking place. And finally, we've looked at how exclusion is played out within the system, so within the classrooms, within the schools, between teachers and students, across the peer group, etc. So different aspects of exclusion which is related to the system. Then at the community level, we are talking about exclusion in terms. So these are the factors that are beyond the system, but which also impact or play a role in excluding children from education. So these could be things related to economic constraints of poverty, or they could be the social and cultural context in which the children are there. For instance, a communally charged neighborhood, or a conflict area, or it could just be issues of gender biases in a community that are against the education of girls, etc., etc. And then we've also tried to look at the intersectionalities of different kinds of marginalization that can have kind of a double or triple impact. So a Dalit girl, for instance, she faces both the issues of being Dalit as well as of being girl, and how does that make her situation that much worse. And finally, we look both at the institutional spaces that exist between the community and the system, and again how discrimination or marginalization plays an impact. So these would be things like PTA, SMCs, etc. And also the other informal mechanisms of interaction of people with the education system and how that is also adds to the feeling of exclusion. So looking at exclusion from the system, which is, these are the categories of excluded that we have looked at, and these are basically the street and homeless, which in terms of provision for education are actually not even sort of counted or included in the in the policies, in the programs that have been made to ensure that they are able to access the schooling system. Similarly, for the children from migrant families, they tend to not be able to find space either in their places of origin or the places that they migrate to. I mean, they might be able to get admission in one or the other, but typically end up dropping out and not being able to complete education in either place. There is the whole category of the stigmatized or children of the stigmatized parents. So, HIV parents, children of HIV parents or HIV children themselves. Similarly with sex workers, and also the category of transgender, which may not strictly fit in here, but which is clearly a category that is faces dropping out. I mean, they may be able to access for a little while in the system, but in most cases they eventually are unable to complete. So in a sense they do, because the system is unable to, it hasn't addressed this category of children at all. They are, we thought we could place them in those that are facing exclusion from the system as a whole. Then of course the children living in various forms of conflict zones, and these also we have disaggregated into those which are in areas facing left-wing extremism. Then there is Kashmir, which is a different kind of a conflict area, and then there are those areas which are prone to communal violence, and each of these in different ways communities of children are getting excluded from the system. The other category we are going to look at is, we have looked at is the nomadic tribes. Again, this is a group that is pretty much completely ignored and has very specific problems which are not being addressed by the education system, because of which most of them tend to be out of it completely. We also, for the moment, included child labor here, but I think this is, we are still a little bit unsure whether it fits squarely in this section, because child labor is a category that is at least acknowledged by the state, and there are some programs to deal with children who might be employed. So we may think of shifting this into another place, but for now child labor is also a category that is going to be here. The other set of issues that we looked at within the system was exclusion by the system, and here I think the main point that we're trying to make is that by and large education, and particularly elementary education, has been a neglected sector of policy of state action altogether. And what that has meant over the years is that those that could afford it, the not the mainstream or the elite sections, have actually sort of left or quit or exited from the sector and opted for private provision, leaving really those who are the most marginalized, the poorest, the most disadvantaged, to deal with a government school system which is in declining in quality. So that itself is a kind of form of exclusion in terms of the state priorities that I think is the overlying argument in this part of the section. And we have looked at the neglect of elementary education through, in terms of financial allocations, in terms of the kind of administrative structures, and in terms of the fact that it is doesn't really take into account the different kinds of situations, particularly the specific problems that might be faced by children from marginalized families. So it's very slow to recognize the special needs. It has the policy down the years has been very sort of caught between trying to follow the universalist frame and trying to target a particular need, and it's really fallen between those two stools. In the end, it's had a very fragmented piecemeal approach and relied largely on just providing incentives to certain groups of marginalized families to try and increase their access to schooling, and we will. And the section talks about how that has not really worked very well. So at the end, what it has done is it has created hierarchies of access at various levels, thriving now, growing private sector, and the problems with the dichotomy between the public and private education, the declining quality in the public schooling system. Even within the public school system, we've talked about how hierarchies have been created between the Kendra Vidyalayas and Sarvodayas and Sarvodaya schools, which are kind of the elite schools within the public sector, highly sort of going against constitutional and other principles. And also between the kind of priority that is given to schools in urban areas and in rural areas. So overall, a story of neglect of education and of creating hierarchies all across. The next part looks at exclusion within the system, and here we have a lot of voices of from different parts of the country, from different segments, the Dalits, the tribals, the Muslims, girls, in terms of their experience. So this section is actually very rich in terms of the experiential voices that are reflected in the different ways in which exclusion is manifested in the schooling system. So whether it is in terms of the kind of infrastructure and access that these children have, both physical and social, in terms of the the kind sometimes there are just large areas which the location might be an axis of exclusion. There are spatial constraints in terms of, say, urban poor areas where the number of children in one classroom may be just too many for there to be kind of quality education taking place. There's also evidence of discriminatory use of infrastructure, so there is a mention of that as well. In the classroom, there are many different forms that exclusion might take in terms of teacher attitudes, in terms of peer group prejudices, in terms of communication barriers, language being one of them, and this is an issue that particularly affects children with special needs who may need many different forms of specialized forms of communication to be able to include them in the mainstream, and those are very, very few and far between. Curriculum and textbooks, which has been looked at quite extensively, and even though the NCF 2005 has made a huge jump in terms of laying out a very inclusive framework, it's a very progressive document. Unfortunately, its translation, both in terms of textbooks as well as in terms of the actual pedagogical methods that are in practice, there are big gaps there because teachers are not quite trained in those methods, and the textbooks also haven't quite imbibed the spirit of NCF 2005. Midday meals, classical issue which has been looked at before, but we provide some more evidence here. And then again end this section on a somewhat positive note to try and look at what might have worked. PGBBs, which are residential facilities for girls in the educationally backward areas, have been extremely successful because they've allowed girls to sort of, in a sense, get rid of the kind of responsibilities of domestic work, etc., that they often face, and they prevent them from being fully participant in the schools, whereas the residential facility allows them to devote themselves to the education aspect much more, and there's a huge demand for them. So that really is one strategy of the government that is working in terms of bringing more girls to school. Various incentive schemes have also played a role, and again this looks at that. There is also a category of community mobilizers that was instituted under the SSA, meant particularly to try and get children from the communities that are disadvantaged into the mainstream, and that also has had some success. It's a good idea, may not have worked entirely, but it nevertheless can be counted as one of the most successful interventions of the system. Next, we talk about move away from the systemic issues, having covered, I think, in the earlier sections most of those aspects. To try and establish also a continuum that exclusion as issues in education are not limited to just what goes on in the school or within the system, but also there could be exclusionary practices or experiences that derive from the social milieu in which the children find themselves. So it could, there would be economic or social cultural factors that play a role in excluding them from education. There are also great intersectionalities of disadvantage, as I mentioned earlier, across categories of exclusion. And there is also an interface of community and system where exclusion may also play out. So some of the questions that we are looking at here are things like how does poverty impact the educational possibilities of a Dalit child. So it's not just a Dalit child but also a poor Dalit child or a poor tribal child or a poor Muslim child, etc. So it's a play of both poverty and the social exclusion that might, how does that work? Similarly, how does the community charged village interfere with the education of, say, Muslim children, or armed conflict intervene in the schooling possibilities of children in tribal areas? How does a family react to the educational future of a disabled child? Do they have any aspirations? Do they think that the system in any way can cater to, or do they, is their historia familiar with the experience? Also, in this section, we want to bring in the issue of the market for unorganized or landless labor, which often the parents' occupations or the parents being in highly vulnerable situations economically, that not just to the standard impact of poverty, but specifically how this factor can affect the situation of children in the education spectrum is also something we will try to look at. And of course, how do community norms of gender and other forms of prejudice intersect with school decisions. Safety issues for girls, another huge area arising from the community situation. The fear of a girl facing any kind of molestation on the way to school or sexual abuse in school, etc., are issues which as a family perceives as problematic and which may lead to exclusion of girl children from school, or at least up beyond a certain level of schooling.
First of all, I want to say that I think many of the ideas that there are here and the larger perspective of education as a public good, and also the role that you give the state. I mean, one is right in tune with all of that. I'll just come to what you have asked, but I don't want to get too much into the report because a lot of the studies and all are there. I thought I would just highlight a couple of things which I feel are extremely disturbing and is likely to impact all of what we are saying. And also because it reflects a little on the state. I feel that in the framework, we also intersectionality, interlocking of inequalities and what that means, and also I think relationality, I mean the whole relational framework has to come in very clearly, because at least in education, it is those who have advantage and privilege who construct what those who do not have. So you have to talk about disadvantage and privilege, you have to talk about advantage and disadvantage, and I think that framework is extremely important, because I'm glad that you've highlighted poverty, because a lot of the education discourse does not look at poverty, and if it looks at poverty, it's largely within a deficit framework of, the cultures of the poor and, their awareness and all that. But there are structural roots of poverty, and you link it to the labor market or, their livelihoods, etc. To say that, poverty is so deep-rooted and structural, and what kind of implications it has for children, their education in the future. Now, there is a larger discourse on poverty and education, which is which is shaping education all across the world, where it is said that education is the route out of poverty. Now, education is not the route out of poverty. Education is the route out of the individual family. But poverty has to be handled at its own terms, in terms of labor markets, etc. So I feel this discourse on what education can do for poverty is problematic, because the entire world is now looking at the school to take people out of poverty, and that school has to be, taken out of the state because the state is inefficient. You have to bring the market in. So I feel that discourse, which is there in the UK, USA, is coming down to India, and we have to be very careful about how we look at that poverty debate. The other is that there's very little work done on what poverty actually does to children's learning. I mean, poverty does affect cognitive development because of lack of nutrition, etc. So I think that is also something we have to look at. Now, that's one thing is, I think it is rightly highlighted poverty, but we need to place the poverty and education discourse so that it doesn't remain at the realm of culture and deficit. So I think that's the second point which I feel And also because that culture, poverty, etc. then is linked to pedagogy and classroom practices, because that is very clearly linked to what is it that we do there. The second point, I think, which I think again the report has to take it, is that there is a changing landscape of education. And that changing landscape today has privatization and marketization even within the government system. So we are looking at the poor and government, or the state. The state has actually opened up even the government schools. And many people are not aware, but even in Delhi, schools private companies have been asked to adopt the municipal schools. So I feel that we really have to look at these larger forces that are shaping education today, that are coming in to bring about policy changes, and a discourse that private is better than public. So I think that is because once you come into that discourse, then exclusion, etc. goes out of the window, because it is said that the private is far more equitable than the state.